The Huns did not succeed in snuffing out every last man, woman, and child, but as you can imagine, it would be a while before the Burgundians caused any trouble for the Romans again. While this slaughter was unfolding, Aetius, Galla Placidia, Valentinian III, and the rest of the Western court were off on a holiday to Constantinople. You may not have noticed because, like his uncle Honorius, Valentinian III isn't really much of an emperor, so he gets properly relegated to the background of his own reign, but the boy has grown up and just celebrated his 18th birthday. So the family traveled to Constantinople to consummate the agreement made by Galla Placidia and Aelia Pulcheria way back in the early 420s. In mid-437, 18-year-old Valentinian III married his 15-year-old cousin, Licinia Eudoxia. With the two halves of the Theodosian family reunited, everyone could rest easy, knowing that the future of the dynasty was in safe hands. What's that you say? Valentinian III and Theodosius II are actually destined to be the last blood emperors of the Theodosian dynasty? Surely not. We've got two of them, teenagers mind you, all set to keep this thing in the family. It's not going to work out, huh? Well, okay, that should be an interesting and bloody transition when we get to it. Staying in the East for the moment, the next year saw the publication of Theodosius II's one true contribution to world history, a contribution that was apparently undertaken of his own initiative. Though the Theodosian walls that bear his name are undoubtedly more famous, the walls are his in name only, as he was just a kid when they were completed by the Praetorian prefect Anthemius. But with the publication in 438 of the Code of Theodosius, the Eastern Emperor finally had something he could point to and say, "That was me, I did that." The Code was the culmination of nearly a decade's work. In 429, Theodosius had appointed a commission to track down and compile every single law, decree, edict, or opinion issued by Roman emperors since 313 AD. Why 313? Well, if you'll recall, that was the year after Constantine defeated Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge, an occasion now understood to mark the beginning of the Christian Roman Empire. Concerned that the empire's laws had become unwieldy and disorganized, Theodosius wanted to create a single source that would define the empire politically, economically, religiously, and culturally for generations to come. Most especially, the personally pious Theodosius wanted to establish once and for all that Orthodox Christianity and imperial rule were inseparable, two sides of the same coin. Published in 16 volumes, the Code was immediately useful to jurists, but still led to complications and confusion. Focused almost exclusively on compiling a century's worth of scattered laws, Theodosius' commission declined to include any sort of explanatory commentary to help lawyers interpret the raw decrees. The commission further declined to even make editorial decisions about which of two contradictory laws to include in the Code, throwing both in if each was found to be independently authentic. As a result, the main legacy of the Theodosian Code was not that it in itself became a lawyer's Bible, but rather that it forms a huge chunk of the Code of Justinian. Compiled and written a century later, the Justinian Code did become a lawyer's Bible, but included helpful commentary and a rationalized set of laws that eliminated as many contradictions as they could find, all tasks made infinitely easier by the initial work done by Theodosius' commission in the 5th century. So good work, Theodosius II. You alone among your 5th century imperial brothers have managed to do something useful, and dare I say beneficial, for your people. While Theodosius was basking in the glow of his own usefulness, Aetius was back in Gaul in 438, trying to keep a handle on the anarchic mess that was the Western Empire. Suffice it to say, the Theodosian Code is not going to be minded much around these parts anytime soon. For the rest of the year, Aetius campaigned against one of those still loose tribes that had come over in 406 and still held on to some territory in Hispania, and the Goths, who were once again trying to break out of the confines of Aquitaine. More than anything else, the Gothic king Theodoric wanted to seize the lands to the south of Aquitaine and win control of a Mediterranean port for his people. And he must have figured that eventually the Romans would be spread thin enough that he'd be able to break through. But Aetius himself faced off against Theodoric, and once again defeated the Goths in battle in terms of peace, but these were apparently rejected by the Romans as being too lenient. So in 439, the Goths went back on the offensive. This time, however, with Aetius back in Italy, the Roman counterattack was led by a subordinate general, who was beaten, captured, and who then died in Gothic captivity. The Romans were then forced to agree to terms with the Goths that were even more lenient than the terms they had rejected, as too lenient just the year before. A Gallo-Roman senator named Avitus brokered a deal that likely involved the Romans recognizing the official independence of the Goths. That same Avitus would later play a key role in swinging Theodoric and the Goths to the Roman side during the Hun invasion of the early 450s, and then a few years after that, ascending to the imperial throne, as a part of that interesting and bloody post-Valentinian III transition I just hinted at. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. That same year saw the Western Empire dealt another setback. Watching as the Romans continued to be tied down with conflicts in the north, the Vandal king Genseric decided that he had nothing to gain by adhering to the terms of the treaty he had signed with Rome 4 years earlier. Staying put in Numidia would just make him a chump, because after all, the rest of North Africa was just there for the taking. No reason not to go for it. It's not like the Romans are going to be able to do anything about it anyway. So in 439, Genseric crossed the border into the province of Africa. Taken completely by surprise, the thoroughly inadequate African garrisons proved no match for the Vandals, and the barbarians were able to waltz right into Carthage without even putting it to a siege. With the entire North African coastline, from the Atlantic to modern Tunisia, now under his control, Genseric's ambitions grew proportionally. Snatch and grab sackings were fine for nomadic tribes living a predatory existence, but Genseric now fancied himself a civilized king of civilized lands. So rather than terrorizing the citizens of Carthage, Genseric instead embraced them as his new loyal subjects, and declared that Carthage would now be the capital of a great Vandal kingdom. Surprised by this turn of events, the Romanized North Africans, well, embraced their new self-proclaimed king right back. It's not like Ravenna had been much for worrying about their needs lately. Despite the fact that the Vandals had been menacing their homes for the last decade, Ravenna had refused to prioritize North African interests, choosing instead to focus on the crises consuming continental Europe. Now that the Vandals had basically won, the citizens of North Africa greeted Genseric's decision to transform himself into a civilized king who respected the civilized rights of civilized people with hope. If the Vandal king really wanted to make a go of it, the people of North Africa were basically ready to support him. The Romans had abdicated their responsibilities, so they were owed no more loyalty. Genseric's occupation of North Africa may have been just that, an occupation, but it was not the most actively opposed occupation of all time. With the help of his new subjects, Genseric began to build a massive fleet of ships to fulfill his dreams of further conquest. Though the Vandals had no real experience with seafaring, Genseric was determined to use the ports of North Africa as a launching pad for the maritime conquest of the Mediterranean Sea. In less than a year, Vandal ships launched from Carthage and landed on Sicily, where they began a systematic seizure of the island. From there, they continued to branch out over the next few years, taking control of Sardinia, Corsica, and the Balearic Islands. The ease with which the Vandals were able to control the Mediterranean is impressive, given, as I just mentioned, they were not exactly a seagoing people. The Phoenicians, they were not. But their exploits should not be too overblown. It had been centuries since the Romans had had to deal with a hostile power roaming our sea, and the Imperial Navy was not the most built-up or well-trained branch of the armed services. The sudden emergence of Vandal pirates swarming over the islands of the Mediterranean was unprecedented, and no one quite knew how to deal with them. In a very real way, Rome was right back where it was before the Punic Wars, with a hostile power based in North Africa, controlling the seas and menacing the Italian coastline. Except that instead of being on the rising tide of the bell curve, the Romans are now on the receding side. I'm sure the ghost of Hannibal looked on with approval, as this time the North African maritime power would not be turned back, and instead overwhelm the Romans and eventually sack the Eternal City, fulfilling the centuries-gone dream of the Barca clan. But that too is for another busy day. Just as had happened after the Vandals initially crossed over into North Africa, their entrance onto the waterways of the Mediterranean caught the attention of Constantinople, and in 441, Theodosius II ordered an expedition to try to stamp them out. But after getting as far as Sicily, this expedition was recalled to the east. After 5 years of fighting in and around Armenia without making any appreciable gains, the Huns decided that Rome was a far easier target than Sassanid Persia, and returned to the Danube frontier thirsty for blood and treasure. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the removal of the Hun threat freed up the Sassanid forces, who, possibly acting at the prompting of Vandal ambassadors, started attacking Roman positions along the eastern border. With the Persians attacking in the far east, Bleda and Attila decided that the time was ripe to squeeze a little bit more juice out of the empire, and so they began attacking Roman positions along the north. Next week, this will all come to a head. Though the Sassanid threat will quickly dissipate, the Vandals were still growing strong, and the Hun threat was just getting warmed up. Indeed, next week we will see the first major successful Hun invasion of the empire. Previous attempts had been half-hearted and short-lived, but this time the Huns meant business, and their ravaging of Moesia and Thrace in the early 440s will firmly cement the legend in the mind of every Roman that the Huns were as horrifying as they were invincible. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 100,000 titles